I put up a poll on Instagram and asked, like, if I was hypothetically going to do a Just Chatting stream, what topics would you be interested in? And the overwhelming majority of people said my experiences working in mental health services. Believe it or not, I did work in mental health services. Before I went into research, I really wanted to be a clinical psychologist, so helping people with mental health problems. I did not go down that route in the end. It wasn't what I expected for a whole range of reasons, which maybe we can go into. For those of you who aren't in the UK, we have a National Health Service, NHS. It's like a social healthcare model, I guess. So people pay their taxes and then they go to the service. They get free treatment, in theory. That's how it's meant to work. I have many opinions about the NHS and working there. You're interested in brains? Well, that's good, because I actually looked at some brains. Like, literally, I looked at some brains. That was pretty cool, actually. A big part of being any kind of... What do they taste like? Oh, I didn't look at them that way. I don't know. I don't eat brains. I'm not a zombie. Tastes like chicken. Not everything tastes like chicken. Food discussion aside, back to the NHS. If I was good at making segues, I would have said something about hospital food, but no, I got nothing. So the NHS is the UK's National Health Service. So it's a socialised healthcare system where we pay our taxes, and then because we're paying taxes, we should be getting free treatment. So we say it's free at the point of contact. You can go to your doctor and it's free. That's how it's meant to work. So in the NHS, there's different services. They all do different things. So the NHS is like a big countrywide system, and it's full of little services and little, what we call trusts. So they're kind of like regional units, I guess. They're like organisations which cover areas of the UK. The NHS is divided up into these trusts, and they all kind of specialise in different things, or they focus in a different area. For example, there might be a NHS trust in Liverpool that is called the Liverpool Health Trust, and then there might be one in Birmingham called the Birmingham Health Trust, and so on, around all of the places in the UK. And within the trusts, they offer a whole bunch of services. The trusts will kind of specialise on a specific type of service. So, for example, there might be a trust that specialises with cancer, or there might be a trust that specialises with mental health. The services that I worked in were all mental health services. That means that they just, well, it kind of does what it said on the tin, really. They just helped people with mental health problems. There are a whole bunch of different services that there can be within mental health services as an umbrella. So there's like layers upon layers going on here. The services that you could work in or that could be offered include things like community mental health. So that's trying to help people out in the community who are suffering from mental health problems and try and support them. They're still going about their daily lives. They might still be working, or they might not. They might be, living in their own home, or they might be living with family or something like that. But the whole point is to try and keep them in their daily routine and to offer support around that routine. There's also inpatient services. So when somebody is really, really struggling and they need a bit more support on a daily basis, they might go into an inpatient service. So this is kind of what would traditionally be labelled like a psychiatric ward, I guess. So yeah, it means that they're in the hospital on a ward, surrounded by staff 24/7. They're surrounded by other patients as well. They're getting a lot more support on a daily basis. And then there can also be kind of additional specialist services as well. So for example, in some parts of the UK, there are eating disorder services that just specialise in helping people that are suffering from eating disorders. There can also be specialist services for people with learning disabilities, so trying to help diagnose things like dyslexia. Specialist community services as well. So some people, if they're not struggling so much that they need to go into hospital, but they do need more support than the community team can offer them, they might go to like a day facility. So they'll go there kind of 9 to 5 and then they'll go back home. So there's like a whole bunch of different choices in terms of service, and all of that together is meant to work in a nice set of harmony, and it should, in theory, provide comprehensive care to everybody who needs it. I say in theory because unfortunately it's meant to work. It doesn't always. I worked across a whole bunch of different services. I kind of checked off a little bit of everything, to be honest. I'm not going to say what my job titles specifically were, and I'm not going to say what services specifically I worked in, but just trust me when I say I covered a fairly substantial range of things. There's more than 2 layers. Yeah, honestly, yeah, the British systems in general, we love bureaucracy. So there will be like layers upon layers upon layers of organisation that doesn't necessarily need to be there, which in all honesty was like a kind of defining feature of my time working for the NHS. Was you have to coordinate 7 different services basically to try and get this one person the help that they need, which is really stressful. Basically, it's not always going to work. It's like a BMW driver's using their indicators. Sometimes they use it and sometimes they don't. Honestly, yeah, it should work. I think that, yeah, it's more like a car that's just needlessly complicated. It's got 17 million buttons and you don't know what half of them do, so you just kind of randomly stab at them until it works. It's kind of more like that, to be honest. You're like, oh, I don't know if this person should go to this service or this service, because they kind of, the descriptions look roughly the same, but they've got slightly different criteria, and then you just kind of just choose one and see if it works, and if it doesn't, then you go to the other. It's a bit of a mess, to be honest. The jobs that I did were kind of a mix, which meant that the stuff that I did was also a mix. I've mentioned that there's a lot of bureaucracy in the NHS, and yeah, that was like overwhelmingly my experience was just doing a lot of admin work, but also just the systems being really, really out of date. You have like waiting lists, right, with patients on it, like all of their details. It will be, you know, like their name, contact number, who to contact in an emergency, their address, stuff like that, how long they've been waiting, what they've been referred for, any diagnoses that they have. One of the services that I worked in, that was entirely done on an Excel spreadsheet, which was disturbing. And there was like no monitoring how long people had been on the waiting list. There was another one where I worked at where it was literally just a whiteboard. And there were a few times where they thought that somebody was being discharged out of the service, so they wouldn't need the help of the service anymore. And someone had wiped them off the board because of that. But then we needed to contact them, or they needed to be brought back into the service, and it turns out the discharge wasn't right. And yeah, it was gone. We didn't have it anymore. So we were like, well, now what? So we had to like dig through what we remembered of their details to try and look it up on the system and try and find them again. They use those analog stuff. Yeah, honestly, I mean, it was probably great for him if he's really bad with modern stuff, but for me it was terrible because I'm sat there like I have to use a fax machine and I don't know what that is, and I don't know how to use it, and they're making me dial in numbers and stuff like that, and I'm sat there like, what even is this? I don't know what this is. I'm scared. Like relying on faxes, and this is like in the 2010s that I worked. Well, yeah, the 2010s that I worked in the NHS, and it's like you are still using fax machines then. This is really upsetting. So the other thing that really, really stressed me out was that every patient that I worked with had like massive medical histories. So they were normally people that had been in mental health services on and off since they turned 18 or even younger. And they would come in and they would have like digital records so they have a really secure system for digital records. So that was fine. And you can search through them really easily. But there was a lot of people who had massive folders of paper notes that had not been touched in about 20 years. So I remember once I was asked to do like a review of somebody's medical history, and I had to order some paper notes, and I was like, okay, whatever, you know, it's going to be like a folder, right? What turned up was, you know, those like really big moving boxes for like when you're moving house, the ones that are like half the size of a person? I got 5 of them stacked up. They were like 3 times the size of me. Because I'm kind of short, but like they were big. I turned around to like the rest of the team and I was like, that is excessive. Do you really need me to go through this? And they were like, yeah. So I had to spend the next 4 weeks going through one person's medical history because there was just so much of it. And obviously, I wasn't doing it 24/7, right? You know, I was doing like maybe 2 or 3 hours a day going through these records. But oh my gosh, it took so long. And like none of it was indexed properly, so I had to actually just go through and check every single bit of paper. Like I couldn't just flip sections over and ignore them. I had to go through every single bit. Crack out the coffee machine, we've got some reading to do. Honestly, that actually was me, except we didn't have a coffee machine. We had to buy our own stuff, actually. The NHS, we can't afford nice things. We had to buy our own tea bags and milk. So I can't have like normal milk, so I had to go out and get soy milk. And like there was only 3 other people that wanted to do it with me, and I wasn't even okay. In the first job that I had in the NHS, it was like voluntary. I didn't even get paid. I was not getting paid, and I had to go out and buy my own tea bags and milk. Bankruptcy, yes. But you can't be bankrupt if you never had any money to begin with, though. But the worst thing with this notes thing, with the 5 boxes of notes. So these 5 boxes of notes, they had this person's entire medical history, but like every single time it was as though they started again. Every single time that this person had gone into a new NHS service, which sometimes was like 7 times in a year, because they went into one and then they did an assessment and then they were like, this is the wrong service, and transferred them somewhere else. They did the same thing every single time. They wrote up exactly the same notes, basically. Based on these notes, the people who had been working with this person previously had like kind of developed a formulation, which is kind of a fancy way of saying like, here are all of the factors that we think are contributing to this person's mental health difficulties. I apparently was the only person that actually went back and read the notes rather than relying on what the previous assessment said the notes said, because every single one of them basically just came to the conclusion that like this person was they were just dealing with some stuff that can't be explained. And if I remember correctly, they'd been diagnosed with psychosis, so they were like hearing voices telling them to do things, and the voices were telling them to do very, very specific things. Everyone just assumed that it was just like a thing that couldn't be controlled and it just came out of nowhere, because some people, it's like a genetic thing, like they just hear voices and they tell them to do things. I went back through all of the notes to the very first assessment, and it turns out that this person actually had a very, very significant trauma in their life that had happened fairly early on, which had been addressed in their assessments from when they were under 18, so it had been put in the notes, but then they had been transferred out of that service, the children's service, very quickly because they were too old. So I think they were about 17 and they had been sent straight to the adult service. It was never brought up again. This person had been in mental health services on and off for about 30 years. The issues that they were having were never actually addressed, basically. And if somebody had just gone back and read the notes, or even just opened the first set of notes, they would have had the treatment that they needed a lot sooner, as in like decades earlier. I don't know, it really stuck with me, because when I pointed it out to the psychologists that I was working with, they were like, that's really important, I can't believe that we missed that. And I'm like, did you read the notes? And they're like, no, of course we didn't, we just relied on what the nurses told us. Somebody's whole life has been ruined because somebody didn't take 15 minutes to read some documents. But the worst part is that wasn't the only time it happened. There was probably 5 or 6 other times where I discovered things hidden in files, like patient files, that had went completely unaddressed up until that point. I think that that's really sad. There should be a way more consistent way to document people's histories, because it's so important. I had a lot of really good experiences as well, but obviously the ones that stick out to me are the bad ones. There was loads of people who I read the notes for and did the summary for the psychologists, and it was exactly what it said in the notes. There was a few other people who what was in the notes did not match up with what they told us. And then you have to start questioning, well, is there a possibility that the patient's understanding of what's happened has been warped by some traumatic experiences or the symptoms they're having? Because that's a possibility too. So it's like an entire complex process. You have to have a lot of time and you need to be in a good mental place yourself in order to do it properly. The problem is that oftentimes you can't be, because there's not enough time. Another big issue that I saw over and over again was that people just did, like the staff just did not have enough time to do the things that they needed to do. So I remember there was one of the nurses in one of the services that I worked for who had 150 patients on her books, and she was meant to be checking up on them every 2 weeks. How is she meant to do that? It's not possible. It's not possible. You cannot check up on 150 people every 2 weeks. You just can't. There's not enough time. It's situations like that where some of the worst things can happen because you might miss a check-in with somebody that really, really needs it. That brings me on to like one of the main things that I had to do personally, which was assessments. So assessments are a really big part of any kind of psychology job. In order to understand why somebody's experiencing certain difficulties, you need to really get to know them as a person, and you need to get to know their history. So that means that one of the main things that you have to do is like talk to them about it, basically. Find out what's going on in their head. You have to find out what's happening in their life, see how all of that kind of comes together. In order to do that, you have to kind of do a bunch of things. So one of them is the looking through their notes. Part of the assessment is based on what other professionals are saying about your patient. There might be a nurse or a occupational therapist, so somebody who kind of helps people in their daily routine. There might be a psychiatrist who is a medical doctor, and there can be psychologists as well. There can be previous psychologists who weigh in too. So a big part of understanding somebody's difficulties is just understanding where they come from. So what happened in their life, what kind of symptoms they're actually having, so what kind of mental health difficulties that they're actually going through. You can also do these like standardized tests. They basically test all of your cognitive abilities. You basically do a whole bunch of, they're just tasks, I guess. For example, you might be asked to draw a clock with the hands pointing to 5 minutes past 3 p.m. Or you might be asked to look at a maze and then find your way from the entrance to the key in the middle. Something like that. Basically, they're all designed to test how your brain works, how you process information, how your memory works, how your attention works, how good your language abilities are, things like that. They can give us a really good indication of where things are. They may be veering from what we may expect. Tasks like in Among Us. Yeah, very sus, very sus. Things that are meant to replicate how you would do things in real life, but there's like a reason for it. With each of the tasks, it's looking at very specific functioning. Attention, your language ability, your memory, things like that. This is like the most stressful thing ever. It's really cool. Like, it's really fun doing it. Like, because you're basically just playing games with someone, to be honest. Like, it's fun. It's like doing board games. But it's also really scary because at the end, for most of them, or the ones that I used anyway, you have to go back and then like edit things. And then like, so you have to like go back. It's all just done on paper. At least it was when I was, because of course it was done on paper. They still use fax machines. We need to fax it to the doctor afterwards. It's all on paper. You go back and then you have to like mark it like a test, like you're in school. It's wild. So you're going back, you're going through, you're writing your like assessment on the test, and then you're adding up their score. This is the worst part of it, to be honest, because I'm really bad at maths. So I'd be there and I'd be like, yes, I'm adding this up. And then it's like, oh, this score suggests that you've got dementia. And then I'm like, wait, no, I forgot to add on a 10. Oh, no, you're fine. That's what they're used for. They're used for things like dementia. They're used for things like learning disabilities or like neurodivergence. So for example, we had one that we used for dyslexia. Also, some of them we'd just use generally. We'd be like, oh yes, this is just a general test to see if your mental health problems are affecting how you think, basically. You're making really important decisions based on this test where you've just like jankily added it up on a calculator. Some of the newer services, the well-funded ones in London, they've got fancy like digital tests where it does it for you, so there's no chance of an error. I never made an error, I would like to add, but there were a few times where I found an error in someone else's scoring. Somebody's entire life can change just by missing out a number. But also, when you actually go back and do a proper assessment, when somebody hasn't necessarily had one for a while, or they haven't been done very well in the past, you can discover things. So there's one person that really stands out to me. They had been in and out of mental health services literally their whole life for like decades and decades. And they had been diagnosed with pretty much every single mental health condition under the sun, including some really quite stigmatized ones as well. So this person, I remember, had at some point in their life they'd had a personality disorder label, which personality disorders, they're manageable, but some mental health professionals will see a personality disorder label and go like, oh, that's it, this patient is like, they're going to be difficult, we can't treat them, that's it. Personally, I think that's more of a reflection on the professionals than anything else, but people do unfortunately have those kinds of reactions. But I went through this person's medical history, and then I also did an assessment with them. And then I also sat in on an appointment that they had with a doctor, like a medical doctor. And I come out of these appointments having done this assessment and having like read through all the notes, and I'm convinced that this person is like neurodivergent in some way. So neurodivergence is when the way that you think about things is basically just different from what would be considered typically developing by the majority of professionals. Yeah, it's not a bad thing. It's just different. Sometimes it can cause issues, but those issues tend to be more like mental health issues around, being treated badly by other people. For example, if somebody's like got a really, really intense interest, or if they really struggle to stay on one topic when they're talking, then people might treat them differently, and then that can cause mental health problems. I came out of these assessments and I was like, this person is 100% neurodivergent in some way. And then I did a bit more digging, and then I found loads of information suggesting that they might be autistic based on some stuff that had been in their child file, which was ignored. I mentioned it to the psychologist. The psychologist was like, that is an interesting idea that has literally never been explored. I left the service before they managed to do a formal assessment for it, but I got told like a year later that it turns out, they were autistic, and they had been going through years and years of treatment, including electroconvulsive therapy, where they stick electrodes on your head and shock your brain for no reason. All of their symptoms were not actually mental health at all. It was just them being different. They weren't suffering because of their symptoms, they were suffering because of the way people were treating them. That, and then like the person who had the 5 boxes of notes, those to me kind of encapsulate the importance of assessment, and that's why I enjoyed doing it. If you do an assessment really, really well, then that is one appointment that can potentially change that person's entire treatment trajectory, and it can change their whole life. That is the impact that psychology can have, I think. And that's not even touching on things like therapy. I didn't do any therapy. I helped with some therapy as like an assistant, but I wasn't allowed to do it because I wasn't qualified enough. I'm still not qualified enough. I'm not a mental health professional. Therapy was not for me, to be honest. It's pretty intense. Being neurodivergent can be really tough. Yeah, it can. Especially when you're surrounded by people that don't understand it, which is definitely something we should be improving on in general, to be honest. Sorry to end it on a bit of a downer. On the bright side, that person then went on and their life changed significantly, and they ended up getting a job and everything. A job that was tying into their interests. So that was really cool. That was really nice. The thing about psychology is that when you're working as a psychologist, it can be very, like, the ups and downs are quite intense. You see people at their absolute lowest. A lot of the times you will see them improve. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't. They will just keep being in a really difficult situation, or they've got patterns of behavior that you just can't intervene on. In order for somebody to make a change in their life using psychological techniques, they need to want it. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who they've been in the pattern that's harming them for so long. It's just easier for them to stay in that pattern. But overall, people get better, I think. That was what I saw anyway. Like, I don't like being negative. There's a lot of good things about working for the NHS and working in mental health services in general. It's amazing when you see somebody who's been struggling for so long and they finally start to make improvements in their life, and then their mental health starts getting better and they start taking better care of themselves. Like, it's wonderful to see it. It's just the whole thing's very emotionally draining, so it wasn't a career that was... it wasn't suited for me. But, that's fine. I'm good at the researchy things instead. And hopefully I'm also okay at teaching. So I'm going to stick to that because that's what I know and that's what I'm good at.